Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Tran, and I'm going to be your moderator for our panel, Essential Asian American Pacific Islander Voices in Young Adult Literature. I'm a library and cultural services supervisor with the Mission Viejo Library in California, and I loved reading the books for this panel. I'm really excited to interview our guest today because the topic of Asian American representation in youth literature is really near and dear to my heart. I am part of a biracial family raising two kids with my Vietnamese American husband. So I am personally really passionate about the topic of Asian American representation in youth literature. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. We have with us today Lori M. Lee, author of the book Pahua and the Dragon's Secret, which is a book 2 in her Pahua Moua series published by Disney, part of the Riordan Presents imprint. So exciting. We also have Kelly Murashige, author of The Lost Souls of Benzaiten, published by SOHO. I'm also pleased to welcome Viet Nguyen, author of Simone, which is published as a picture book published by Astra Books for young readers. And finally, Kashmira Sheth, author of I'm From Here Too, published by Holiday House. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm so excited to have you all here. So the way this panel is going to work is I'd like to kick it off with a question for all of you that you'll have about a minute or two to answer. And then I'm going to turn to individual questions that you'll have a little bit more time to answer. And we're really going to dig into your fantastic books. So let me kick it off with saying we're here to discuss Asian American Pacific Islander representation in youth literature. But let's acknowledge that when we talk about Asian and Asian American and Pacific Islander cultures, so many cultures in that region. It's not monolithic. There's so much variety within the category known as Asian American Pacific Islander cultures. So can you please share with us some of the joys and challenges of bringing specific aspects of your cultures to young readers? And I'm just going to go with who's on my screen first. So Viet, would you mind kicking it off?
Well, sure. I didn't actually want to go first, but anyway,
Sorry.
representation, guy shouldn't go first. I thought it was, I grew up in the libraries as a young refugee boy in the 70s and 80s, and I don't really recall much in the ways of diverse representation. Nevertheless, I fell in love with literature through the power of stories. So for me, when I talk about Asian American and Pacific Islander representation, you're absolutely right. We need to get down into, very specific cultures and histories and all of that. We also, need to tell really wonderful stories, and we have to figure out a way to balance these two things at the same time. I think that's what's really exciting about this moment in children's and young adult literature, which I've come back to after some 30 years because I became a parent. So really excited to be on this panel with people doing really different things, but definitely combining the power of storytelling with the urgency of representation.
I love that. It seems like there's so much to be said for having that experience in a library as a child and then realizing as an adult that you can add more to what your children might find in the library shelves, which is really exciting. Lori, how about you?
I have to stop pushing the wrong buttons. I'm sorry. Um, it's hard because growing up there was there's already so little Asian representation in general, even less southeastern Asian representation, and then none for Hmong specifically representation. So for the longest time, I wasn't even sure whether that was a thing anybody even wanted, to hear about because of that reason. It just didn't exist. So I think the challenge for me was how does this stand out? How do I introduce my culture in a way that is unique to my culture? You know what I mean? So it isn't, oh God, does it even make sense?
Yes,
it does. Because it is so unknown, but when you look at it, when you look at the culture, it pulls in so many from all these other different Southeast Asian countries, like from Thailand and from Laos and Vietnam, but it is its own distinct thing. And oftentimes explaining that to people just like face to face is difficult. So doing it through stories and doing it through books is like a whole different monster.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you're like really trailblazing, writing stories about a culture that maybe even has a little less representation than the average AAPI book, which is wild. And we're all glad that you're here. So it must be a challenge to like balance these things that are just part of your culture and are just normal versus your readers who may be experiencing this culture for the very first time through your books.
Right.
So
and
amazing.
they have like and their only frame of reference, of course, you know, is what they already see,
Right.
which they'll have never seen, you know, among specific cultural elements.
Oh, that's a huge responsibility. And we're going to come back to that in some of my individual questions for you. So we'll dig a little bit deeper. That's a great introduction. So Kelly, how about you bringing specific aspects of your culture, Japanese American, and I believe you grew up in Hawaii. Is that right?
Right, yes. So I did grow up in Hawaii and I'm still in Hawaii. And I think the idea of AAPI cultures never being a monolith is a really big thought for me, just because a lot of the population here is AAPI, but even here, there is no one singular experience. I don't feel like I can speak on behalf of anybody else. I think the goal is always, especially when it comes to children and young adult literature, is you want to help people feel less alone and like they feel seen. So that's always going to be my goal.
I love that. And that's such a good point that, you know, even a panel like this where we are highlighting Asian American Pacific Islander voices in youth literature, that kind of puts a bit of a responsibility on all of you to somehow like be the voice. And, you know, there's no one voice for, you know, something that's not one culture. So anyway, as I said in the beginning of this panel, I really enjoyed reading all of your books. And I think it's important to acknowledge like the joys and the responsibilities and challenges. So Kashmira, how about you?
So I grew up in India, and you know, not only talking about the whole South Asian Pacific Islander culture, even in India, I feel like there's just so many different cultures. And I learned actually more about different parts of India after coming to this country, you know, having friends from different parts of India. So I feel like that. But I think that writing about one individual or, you know, a set of character and making it very specific, I think it connects with the reader really well, because it just produces that connection. And I hope that there are more stories and more diverse character that kids can read about and feel connected to them through literature.
I love that, what you just said about like telling an individual story, because that does break down that idea that it's all monolithic and that any one author or any one character can represent all of this at once. And it helps readers connect as individuals, you know, to other individuals, whether they're real or fictional. It's just really important experience to have. And before we pivot to our individual questions for you guys today, I wanted to just make a correction, an editorial note, if you will. Kashmira, your book is with Peachtree. I am so sorry I misspoke. I had the wrong publisher in my notes. Oh my gosh. We're all human and sometimes our notes get mixed up. But thank you to Peachtree. Very excited to have Kashmira here. All right, let's go ahead and pivot to my individual questions for you all. So Lori, I wanted to circle back to you and how we were talking about like, wow, Hmong representation is incredibly short supply in youth literature. So it's really exciting to see your books, and from such, you know, with a big name like Riordan presents. Very cool. And you know, as I was reading your book, I was thinking about like the representations of Hmong culture that I have seen in media, and it's often really sobering depictions of the refugee experience. And that's an incredibly important story to tell, and it should be told, but it's not the only story. So tell us about your process and kind of what it meant to you to bring Hmong joy to the page in the context of this like very exciting, sweeping fantasy adventure with your Pahua series, and I believe your other books too, you know, fantasy. Tell us about this.
The short answer is representation, but the long answer, I guess, is, you know, it's sort of the universal immigrant refugee experience, right? There was no, there were no mirrors, growing up. All of the fiction and media and just books and magazines and everything that all around me in my small little Wisconsin town, it was telling me that there wasn't any sort of place for people who looked like me. So that sort of drove me through some like difficult childhood times in terms of like acceptance and understanding the importance of like holding on to the things that our culture has gone through. But because of that, I did push away a lot of those stories that focused so much on the trauma and the war and everything that happened with the Vietnam War specifically. At that time, I think I could literally only think of like two books off the top of my head that went over the Hmong experience. And like you said, it always focuses so much on everything, on the trauma of like our culture as a whole, because in the entire Hmong history, it is always a story of immigration, I guess, because the Hmong began or originated in China, and then they left because of oppression, and then everywhere else they settled, they were eventually uprooted, and then to now today, so many Hmong people are uprooted and then transplanted here in the U.S. And all those stories, like you said, are incredibly important, but it did narrow my appreciation, I guess, of what my culture meant and what it meant to like, the community at large. And I didn't want to just be that. I looked around and I saw, fantasy, and I saw Cinderella, and I saw all these adventures that all these people could go on, but it wasn't me, because, I was only associated with this terrible, depressing, dark history. So with books being my escape, as most kids do, I went into books and I absolutely fell in love with the fantasy genre. But the problem was that the fantasy genre didn't seem to love me back. So for a long time, I was writing stories that I erased myself from these stories, because I didn't think that, I just thought that's how it was. I didn't realize then that that's a thing that we can change. It's just, I thought this is how it is. So I started writing things like that. And my siblings called me out on it a couple times. They're like, if you want to be a writer, why are you not writing about like the Hmong? And I immediately associated that with writing about trauma, because that's all there was. It's like, I don't want to write about that. I want to write joy. And it was not until I was older, until, not even that long ago, when I realized that I could give that joy to these younger generations of Hmong kids who are growing up in a time when they have the benefit of so much more representation than I did.
Wow, that's really powerful. It sounds like you had to work through a lot to get to where you are now with your writing, and that's just like your internal journey as an author. I mean, I'm sure like I'm sure there's been bumps in the road with like the publishing industry and all of these things. So, I'm so glad you're here today and to tell us all about this. And your books are out there for young readers. It's just like, my goodness, thank you. Thank goodness for the changes that have taken place. And, we can all still be advocating for increased representation, right? It's not done for sure. All right, I'm going to pivot to Kelly. I have a question for you. So, your protagonist, Machi, in The Lost Souls of Benzaiten, is dealing with some really tough stuff to the point where she can't or won't talk. But for a character who doesn't talk, Machi has an incredibly strong voice. I just immediately like latched onto her when I started reading and her voice came out on the pages. So I would love to hear how you developed her character, kind of how she came to you, and also how you kept yourself emotionally balanced while writing a character who's having such an intense time navigating trauma and grief.
Well, first of all, thank you for your really kind words. And that is a very hard question, especially since Lori did a fantastic job answering. But I think it came from my being a quiet girl. In case you haven't noticed, I'm really shy, and it was even worse when I was younger. A lot of people were just like, "Do you even talk?" But the first time I wrote this story, it was actually a totally normal protagonist. But it wasn't until I rewrote it something like months later, and Benzaiten was always at the heart of it. But then I made Machi the main character, and I realized, I always think I wrote as a way to process things, as a way to speak out in a way that I couldn't really always do audibly. And so I really wanted to make that the focus. And in terms of just writing a character who has been through a lot, I think Machi and I have one thing in common, or well, a lot in common, but we both kind of have a dry sense of humor. And I added some of the quirkiness, the whole thing is she wants to be a robot vacuum cleaner. And then Benzaiten comes down to be like, what are you talking about? And I think that's something that I've always, not that I wanted to be a robot vacuum cleaner, but I just kind of process things in a bit of an eccentric way, I guess. So I think that was a good way for me to kind of help her get through what she's going through. She just processes the world in a very different way.
I really love that. So I'm going to ask a follow-up question about the robot vacuum cleaner element. So for readers who have yet to read this book and are about to enjoy it, as Kelly mentioned, her main character starts out the book kind of like just wanting to, I guess, disappear from her life, and essentially like she would love to become a robot vacuum cleaner. So Kelly, how did that come to you? I loved the way you explained it in the book, but if you can enlighten us a little bit on the panel, and also okay, I hope I can ask this. Were you legally not allowed to say Roomba, or did you always want to keep it like a generic brand robot vacuum cleaner?
Well, in terms of the name brand, I don't actually have one, unfortunately, so I'm not that familiar with name brands. And as for why I chose that, it's actually a little bit funny. My editor, Alexa, kind of, when we were going through rounds of revisions, she was the one who said, you might want to add some background as to why a robot vacuum cleaner, because in the first draft, she just wanted that. There was no explanation as to why. I think because it made sense in my head, just because the thing about a robot vacuum cleaner is it has a responsibility, and then it's nothing else is really expected of it. You don't expect it to like go and water your plants, for example. You don't want it to speak to you. And I think that was just something that I felt like Machi would understand. So that's kind of something that I put out there and then kind of had to later rein back in, or at least justify. So it's been an interesting experience.
I really think it worked because it was so unexpected that it definitely grabs the reader's attention. And then that whole explanation of how the robot vacuum cleaner only has the one job, that is beautiful. Like, don't we all wish that life were a little simpler sometimes and we knew exactly what was expected to us? So that is something I never would have thought would resonate with me, and it totally did. So I love that. All right. My next question is for Viet. So talk to us about your picture book, Simone. It's such a layered book addressing topics ranging from like climate change driven disasters. There's a wildfire. And you also weave in there the immigrant experience, trauma from navigating these kind of natural disasters, incarcerated individuals, and it's all from the point of a young Vietnamese American girl. And I have to say, as an aside, the wildfire premise really hit me hard. And before the book even revealed that it took place in California, and as a Californian, I was like, oh, this is exactly when and where. Like, I knew what fires you were talking about. So whew, it's unfortunate. If you know, you know, right? But talk to us about how you wove like your own personal experiences into this book and how you addressed all of these really complex topics for young readers in a very successful way.
All credit goes to my illustrator and Minnie Fan, who actually came up with the idea of Vietnamese American girl confronts wildfires, but then she didn't really know what else to do with it. And then she gave the idea to me, and so I wrote the rest of the story. And so, like Lori, I'm very conscious of the fact that for Vietnamese people, Vietnamese refugees in the diaspora were overshadowed by a horrible history of war, revolution, trauma, and so on. And thankfully, I've talked a lot about that in my other books. So it totally freed me in this book to write about something completely different. And of course, the fact is that there are a lot of Vietnamese people and other Asian Americans living in California, and we undergo all the other kinds of things that other Californians undergo. And that was, in this case, wildfire, which isn't just a California thing, but obviously now a global phenomenon. And so once the premise was in place, young girl confronting wildfires, I just wanted to pursue what that would be like, to tell a story from her point of view, what she would undergo, the stresses, the traumas, the fears, and how she might be able to cope with it. And as I also filled in the rest of her family history and her character, that she has a mother from Vietnam, it just became logical that when the family is confronting wildfire and displacement here in California, the mother might remember what happened in Vietnam. And in her case, the one detail that I focused on was flooding, which is also a real global phenomenon, but something that's very impactful in Vietnam as well. So the mother is able to connect her experience being displaced by flood with the daughter's experience and the mother's experience being displaced by fire. And the last thing to point out here is, it's a story that's very whimsical and very hopefully magical in some ways because of the power of Minnie's illustrations and the fact that our little girl Simone turns to the power of art to try to comfort herself and to comfort other kids and to find a way to imagine a different world. But along the way, she encounters some very serious things. So when she leaves the house in the first few pages, fleeing from these wildfires, the first thing that she sees are not only the fire engines outside her house, but the firefighters. And some of these firefighters are wearing these orange uniforms of the CDRC, the California Department of Rehabilitations and Corrections. And that's a real thing, prisoner firefighters. So it wasn't, I think, a stretch to put that into the book. It was simply, this is a part of our landscape, our socio-political landscape that kids see. And so when Lori mentioned, well, oh, I'm sorry, when Kelly mentioned being seen as being important, it's not only our ethnicities, nationalities, cultures, and so on, but lots of different populations. So it was really crucial for her to see that there were these prisoner firefighters, and then for her to have to engage with her mother and find out why are there prisoners fighting fires? And when we talked about this book for the very first time yesterday, Minnie and I, in front of an audience at the LA Times Book Festival, one of the questions from probably a 6-year-old boy was, why are there bad guys fighting fires? And that's exactly the kind of conversation that I wanted to have. Not necessarily me trying to answer, although I did, but that parents would have to answer these questions with their kids. So hopefully it's a book that is beautiful to look at because of Minnie's illustrations, but a book that's also really grounded in some of the challenges that we're all facing, whether we're Vietnamese or Asian Americans or just other people who are not of those backgrounds.
Yeah, I think you and Minnie really, really nailed it. And that I was just thinking about that like, I wonder all of the conversations that parents will have with their kids after reading it. I think there's so many topics that are touched on that really like so many different conversations could come out. And I also really appreciated, in California, we had those wildfires and it was also basically we were still at the height of the pandemic. So, the little ones reading this now, probably too young to remember that, but it really hit upon that sense of like having to completely rearrange a person's life on the fly and still remain hopeful and find beauty in things like art. So it really has a lot to think about. So thank you for that. It was as a Californian, it really hit. And then and I loved the representation of the little Vietnamese American girl going through all this and her mother relating it. To her youth. Beautiful. All right, Kashmira. From in your book, I'm From Here Too, your main character, Anoop, is really keenly aware of how he is perceived as like foreign in the United States. But during the book, he goes to visit India to connect with family, to go see his grandfather. And suddenly he feels too American and not Indian enough. And I think this dynamic, from what I've heard, is really familiar and will resonate with so many children of immigrants who are kind of, between two cultures, and also children of biracial families. Like my kids are not children of immigrants. My husband was born here, but they're still acutely aware that like they're not quite one or the other. So it's really common. So knowing that, tell us about your approach. Did you think this was a dynamic that you wanted to explore in this book from the beginning, or did it just kind of come about as you were writing? And then also, how did you decide how Anoop would resolve this feeling of being caught between two cultures? Because I really liked the way he comes to feel really pleased with who he is.
So I don't think I started out thinking how that Anoop would feel, that he doesn't belong to either place completely, because I don't usually have my whole story plotted out. I tried, but I just can't do it. So but I know from experiences. I lived in a smaller town with my grandparents till I was 8. Then I came to the big city of Mumbai, and I felt like I was an outsider in some ways, even though I was in the same country. And I know my children and other immigrant children felt the same way here, that they were living between the two cultures. I also was in Madison, Wisconsin for years, and I really, I taught dance to children, and a lot of Hmong children too. And I enjoyed their dancing, and there are a lot of festivals. And so I got to know those kids, and I realized that, that part of, every child around that age, there is some kind of feeling that they don't completely belong. Even children whose grandparents and great grandparents came to this country, they also felt in some way sometime. So I know that there's always that, but I feel like when the child is bullied or something happens, or they are afraid about certain things because of the way they look or how they talk or what they wear, it must go way beyond that who am I and where do I belong? That, as I was writing, I felt that. And when Anoop goes to India, he's born in the United States, and it is a different world there. Lots of sensory detail bombarded on him. Religion is important to him here too, but there it is very different, because his cousin is living in it every day, absorbing it at more osmosis, but he doesn't. So there is that part. So I think that was all that kind of combined together. And as I wrote, I realized that would be something that he would feel very strongly, that he does not belong in one place or the other. I think how he resolved this faith, that I started out thinking even before I wrote the book, that the faith had play a big part, because I've always admired Sikhism. I thought that the Sikh is a religion that I felt like the equality and justice, but also courage and bravery are a big part. And the way the 10 Sikh gurus fought for equality, it's really very touching. So I wanted that part, like he could have some kind of strength, inner strength, gained from who he is, as he meets his grandfather and also goes back to his history.
Yeah, that was really touching. I think we always, as readers, root for, these characters that we get attached to really, become happy with themselves. If they're not happy to begin with, to like find that self-acceptance, and finding it through, one's generational story and one's culture. is like, it's so satisfying as a reader. I love that. So my next question, I'm going to circle back to Lori. You've primarily written for a young adult audience before the Pahua series. So what drew you to pivot over to a middle grade audience? And was it challenging, or did it just kind of flow naturally to write for this different age group?
It was definitely challenging at first because, like you said, I have basically only written for YA prior to Pahua, and I didn't think I had the voice for a younger audience, because middle grade has a very distinctive voice, and my work, especially in my most recent young adult series, is just darker. So but I had always wanted to write middle grade. I just didn't think I had the voice for it. But when I had the idea for Pahua, I knew that I had to make it middle grade because I wanted it to be fun and an adventure and very, very quest, but like not high epic fantasy, like super intense like that. But I wanted it to be goofy and silly, and I wanted to be able to put ridiculous humor in it, like my talking cat. And I knew that if I did it as a YA, which is not to say YA can't have humor and comedy and fun, because there definitely is, but I wanted to go to a length that I really I didn't feel I would be able to do with YA, because with YA I would just be tempted to go dark. That's just me though. Like when I write YA, my mind goes to a more serious, a darker place. Whereas when I wrote Pahua as a middle grade, it was the most fun I've had writing a manuscript, actually, because I just went all in with my awful dad jokes, and it was great. So yeah, I listened to nothing but middle grade audiobooks for like a month while I was like researching for the book, and that helped a lot with taking my head out of the YA space and firmly into the middle grade space. Now I feel like I can do it a little better because I've got the second book done, and it's not such a huge change to switch from YA to middle grade. So hopefully I didn't just jinx myself, but yeah.
No, not at all. I love that, like in your kind of author story, it seems like you've had to overcome a lot of, I don't know, like self-doubt, like can you tell these stories, or can you write for this audience? And it's so cool that you're here as a success story, having done these things that you were initially not too sure about. So I love that.
Thank you.
It reminds us all to, like, go be determined and do the things we want to do. And your chapter titles, I have to say, like, were really so fun, kind of in the grand Rick Riordan tradition. Did you have fun coming up with all the funny chapter titles?
Yeah, those are like, it's hard because sometimes I think I'm funny, but I'm the only one who thinks I'm funny. So,
did you have to like workshop them with your editor then? Is that...
Not really, no.
Okay.
I would just like sometimes I would come up with the title and be like, yeah, I'm really clever. And then like the next title will be like, wow, that's awful, but we're just gonna go with it. So I think my favorite chapter title from the first book is King Arthur Did It Better. No spoilers.
I liked all the titles. It was good. You made me laugh, so. And I think so I'm going to pivot back to Kelly now. So Kelly, your book incorporates one of Japan's traditional like mythology figures, the traditional 7 lucky gods. They're very all Japanese people grow up knowing the 7 lucky gods. And Benzaiten, one of the 7 lucky gods in your book, is a very 3-dimensional character with like her own emotional journey to process. She's a deity, but she's having a whole time. So tell us how you decided to bring Benzaiten to life as a full-fledged character. You mentioned earlier that she had always been a presence in all your drafts. Did you grow up with stories of the 7 lucky gods? And if so, like, how did you choose which one was going to figure in your story? Because there's 7 of them, so.
I did grow up with a lot of Japanese folk tales, but I actually didn't hear about the seven lucky gods until I was much older. And this is kind of venturing away from the question, but I think because I grew up in a place that is so accepting of Asian culture, I actually kind of, when I was younger, worried that I like wasn't special enough to tell these kinds of stories. But I think it wasn't until I was older and I started learning the language and kind of reconnecting with that culture that I started researching Japanese mythology. And Benzaiten is the only confirmed female deity among the seven gods of fortune. And so I was kind of like, oh, it's a girl. And so when I figured out that she's in charge of everything from, love to music and speech, and there are some stories about how, if you go to this certain park, then since she's the goddess of love, she might spurn you, something like that. So I thought, oh, she has kind of a personality. And so I put her in from the very beginning and she kind of developed, she ran away on her own. And when I realized that Machi couldn't really speak, and Benzaiten, one of Benzaiten's realms is speech, I thought it was, just the perfect fit, and everything started to come together, and that she was a big part of Machi's story, but also she has her own story and her own background. So it all kind of started out as one big mess and it came together very slowly.
That's cool to hear about your process. And one of the things I like as a reader is when a book makes me want to go research, the background of what the subject matter is. So I feel like a lot of your readers are just going to like really dig into this book and really go along on the emotional journey. And then when they're done, like they're going to look up those seven lucky gods if they don't know them already. And, about shrines and temples and like, just all of that wonderful back matter that, as librarians, we always hope that readers will want to pursue, because that means they're going to come to the library and, and check out more books. Or we can help them with our online databases. All right, Kashmira, the partition of India in 1947 plays a really poignant role in your main character's family history. And this is such a significant historical event with reverberations that are still felt today. But unbelievably, this is rarely taught in American schools. It's pretty embarrassing. I mean, I feel like I just learned about it myself as an adult a few years ago, which, come on, American school system, what's going on? But you even referenced that knowledge gap in the text, which, I appreciated. So talk to us about how it felt and what your process was writing about this incredibly important piece of history that, a lot of your audience, American middle schoolers, are likely to still be unfamiliar with.
Yes. So interestingly, when I was growing up, India was independent, of course, and we learned a lot of history, and India has a long history. So it started out from way back and up to the Mughal period and the colonial ruling, and also a lot about all the viceroys and everything, I remember, and then the freedom fighting and all that. But when it came to partition, it was just mentioned that then partition happened, and it was glossed over about any kind of human suffering. We did not, hear much about it. Maybe it was too much, too soon. Maybe people did not want to face it. But after coming here, I met a lot of people, from India, that their family had fled, from one part to another. And so they were their personal stories. These were my friends whose family had, gone through it. And so my interest grew more and more, and I read a lot of things, and that really always had me become emotionally when, about thinking about all this human suffering. And as we hear about other refugees, that it's been going on and it still goes on. And so I wanted to explore that more. And, like I said, some of my friends' family did experience that. Our family didn't, because we were not from the part, but of India that was partitioned. but I think it affected a lot of people directly or indirectly, because I was called Sindhi when I was in India for whatever reason. And Sindh is the part of India that went completely into Pakistan. So they somehow thought that I was, one of the refugees for whatever reason, the way I look. So it kind of was there. And I wanted to explore that. But I thought, especially when the Punjab was divided, families were separated. And Anup family, being Sikh, would be one of those families that would have to leave if they were in the wrong side of the border, and the border was just drawn without any kind of consideration or anything about the people. So I thought that kind of made it, and that he could see what the strength from the faith can do for his grandfather, and maybe he could learn from that history.
Yeah, that was really beautifully told. And the connection between the main character and his grandfather with that, the recent history that the grandfather had lived through. And I mean, I find that a lot of times when the older generations have gone through something really traumatic, they often don't want to address it with their children or their grandchildren. It's too much to talk about even decades later. So it was just really touching that that you worked that element of that history into your story, and that your main character got to connect with his grandfather. I think that means a lot to readers of this age group too. They love their grandparents, which I love to see. It's really lovely. So Viet, your range as an author is incredibly broad. You mentioned earlier that you had addressed a lot of Vietnamese war history and refugee dynamics in your other work, which you have a lot of other work. You've written fiction, nonfiction, memoir. Most of your books are for adults. But as we've discussed, Simone is for young readers. It's a picture book, your second picture book, actually. So talk to us about what drew you to writing a picture book, and what do you like best about writing for children?
So, I think of myself as a writer first and foremost, not as a writer of a particular genre. So all the different forms of writing feed into each other. And I hadn't read children's literature for 30 something years until I became a father, and had to start reading it with my children. And what I just rediscovered through that experience was how playful children's literature is. That there are no rules, I don't think, in children's literature. You can do whatever you want. And as long as the readers like it, then you're absolutely free. And that's completely unlike what it means to be an adult author or writing for adults, because adults have rules. So if you deviate from the rules that adults have for whatever they think fiction looks like, for example, or a memoir, a substantial number of these adult readers will freak out. So I wanted to get some of the freedom back that I think children's writers have. So it's affected my writing for adults, but writing for kids, it's just tapping into a more, to me, emotional source, more poetic source. I don't write the children's books as prose. I write them as poetry, even though they may look like prose. Because I think for me, the children's works that hit me the strongest have that impact at the level, not only of the image, but at the level of the word and the rhythm as well. So it's a creative challenge for me, but it's also a joyful challenge to try to figure out how I can capture some of that playfulness, which I can then eventually funnel back into my writing for adults as well. And then the last thing is, becoming a father was a very emotional, and still is a very emotional experience for me, where I've learned a lot about my children, but also about myself. And I think that Simone, the book, is among other things, a book about emotion, about the relationship between a mother and a daughter, and this daughter confronting the world and learning something about herself. That to me has been a joy, to be able to work at the level of emotion as well.
I love that. And I love that your writing for children is now influencing your writing for adults, because I think probably adults can do well to kind of channel their inner child now and then, and maybe break some rules and mix it up a little, have some more whimsy. So that's really cool to hear about. We have just a couple minutes left, so I'm actually going to follow up all of my individual questions with one more question for all of you, just kind of a lightning round. talk about your writing processes a little bit. And I always like to hear, is there something like you have to have when you go into writer mode, like a music, a playlist, a beverage, lucky pair of socks? Tell us what it looks like when you sit down to write. Let's start with Lori.
Can I actually go second?
Of course. And by the way,
Sorry.
too, if you don't have a special thing that you have to have, like that's also a valid answer. If any of you are like magical and you can just like write in any environment with any kind of circumstances going on, share that with us.
Okay.
Okay. I broke the tension. Lori's ready.
For the longest time, actually, I didn't have any place to write, and like my kitchen table was my writing spot, and I would write between like the hours of 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. because I had like young children and a day or 9-to-5 day job, and it was just a lot to tackle. But we recently moved, and now I'm in my office that has been like this for 2 years because I haven't gotten my bookshelves up. But I have my own space now, and that's helped a ton. And I learned to write through my husband blaring his speakers at like ear bleeding levels, and my children screaming at the top of their lungs. So I'm pretty good at just I can just do anything anywhere. I don't really have any rituals.
That's amazing. I really admire that. And I can relate too, because ever since my husband and I had kids, we no longer have a home office. So I'm not a writer, but any work I do is done in like a little corner of my bedroom. It's not great. And my husband also likes to blare music. So solidarity on that. But
do you recall that video clip from several years ago of the guy of the I'm not even sure what he was, but he was like on a video call with someone, and then his kid comes like prancing in on the back. Yeah, that's me. Like I shut the door and I'm doing my things, and then I'll even lock it, and then I'll hear jiggle, 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 jiggle because my kid's trying to come in.
Yes, I knew exactly what you were going to describe, that BBC guy and his 2 kids. They are like our modern day heroes, just busting in on dad.
Yes.
Love it. Kelly, what about you? What's your writing process like? Is there anything you have to have, or can you just like sit down and go?
I will contort myself in weird ways to write. Like I look like a little just hunched over. I don't really have any other things. I usually put on music really quietly just because my brain needs something to listen to. But other than that, it's just kind of whenever.
Nice flexibility, but music is important. What about you, Kashmira?
So I usually don't have anything. I have to have my family around in the sense that I need to ask them questions. I have my mom, especially if I'm writing something with historical thing, I get a lot of information from her. And if I'm writing something from now, I ask my children about, school, this, that. So it helps to have that. But yeah, as long as I have my, computer, and then I can go in coffee shop, people can be talking, I can go anywhere and write when I'm writing. I tend to not read the same thing I'm writing though. So I read adult books or nonfiction or something else. So that process though, that helps me, at least when I'm really first time writing the draft.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense, to like keep your voice exactly how you want it to be. This is so cool. I always love to hear about people's processes. So let's wrap up with Viet. What about you and your writing process? Do you have to have a certain thing or atmosphere?
Well, now I have a camera ready office here, but like most of you, for most of my life, I did not have that. I remember writing my first novel in the guest bedroom facing a blank wall, and then revising that when I had a kid, watching over him at night, like up until 3 a.m. while he was asleep. So there was no romance about any of that. Just needed some peace and quiet, which is why whenever the baby stirred, I would just put a bottle of formula in his mouth to keep him quiet for 10 more minutes or something. So yeah, I think, I'm gratified to hear that. I think for all of us, it's been pragmatic, just finding any nook of time where we can, especially if we have other obligations, father, husband, professor, in my case, And so, yeah, I hope that's inspiring for writers out there, right? That you don't need the camera ready setup and that you should be able to write in almost any circumstance.
I think so. I know I feel inspired by all of you. So thank you so much. I think it is time for us to wrap up. So I just really want to extend my gratitude to all of you. This has been such a fantastic conversation. Again, I really enjoyed reading all of your books, and I know that all of our audience members are really going to enjoy them as well. So thank you for putting a bit of yourselves out there and also for your time today. Thank you so much. And thanks for everyone tuning into this session to watch. I hope everyone's having a great day today. So we're wrapping up here, but the next panels coming up for you to choose from include Faces of Mental Health or your next group read. So have a great rest of your day, audience members and authors. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.